Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Rockefeller College's Lunch and Learn discussion. Today we're talking about Greenland. This is the second of our Spring 2026 Lunch and Learn series. We are still working on the schedule for the coming semester, but what we do have pinned down at the moment is our next event, which is going to be held on Tuesday, February 3rd, again from 12 to 1 p.m. via Zoom. And its title is Unrest in Minnesota, Politics, Policing and Protest. And we will be joined by Dean Julie Novkov and Professor Rob Warden from the School of Criminal Justice. So for today's event, we're going to be talking about what's been going on over the past couple of weeks in Greenland and the implications that this has for the stability of the international system. And so I'm Brian Greenhill. I'm the chair of the Department of Political Science, and I'm also an associate professor in the department with an interest, or my area of specialization is international relations. And I'm very glad to be joined today by four of my colleagues from the international relations subfield. We've got Professor Bryan Early, Professor Greg Nowell, Professor Chris Clary, and Professor Rey Koslowski. So the way we're going to run things today is I'm going to give a little brief kind of synopsis of what's been going on in Greenland. Then I'm going to turn over to each of our panelists to give some of their reflections on the state of events and what their longer term implications might be. And then we'll open it up to questions for the audience. So before I get started, I just want to go over the usual ground rules. Many of you are already familiar with them. Of course, we ask please remain muted during the presentation, but you can use on Zoom the raise hand function if you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A session, or you can type a question into the chat window. If you like, you can type your question into the chat window for everyone to see, or you can instead just direct it to me directly, in which case then I will keep it in my list of questions and I will direct it to the whoever I think is best suited to answer that one. Okay, so let me just start by talking about why we're here today discussing Greenland. So until relatively recently, Greenland was not considered a particularly kind of geostrategically important part of the world to be discussing. Obviously, that has changed dramatically. Greenland, as many of you will already know, is part of Denmark. It is a self-governing territory of Denmark where the citizens of Greenland are Danish citizens and they're represented in the Danish legislature. But Greenland has the right to hold a referendum on independence if and when it decides to do so. Greenland, although it's a very small population, it has become of much greater geostrategic importance in recent years, in large part because of climate change. That has kind of opened up the Arctic to kind of easier shipping transportation and so on. Russia and China, as well as the US, are more interested now in the strategic importance of Greenland. Now, as many of you will remember, Donald Trump, during his first term in office, expressed some interest in acquiring Greenland. And at that time, most people just kind of laughed it off. They thought it was just some completely kind of unserious rambling by the president. And nobody really gave it much more thought other than just kind of joking about it. This time around in Trump's second term, things have become a lot more serious. You may remember back last March, the Vice President J.D. Vance did an official visit to Greenland. In the weeks before Trump's inauguration last January, his son, Donald Trump Jr., did an unofficial visit to Greenland. In August of last year, there were reports coming out of Denmark that the US was sponsoring a covert influence campaign in Greenland to try to kind of pry the citizens of Greenland away from Denmark and make them possibly more amenable to um, switching allegiance to the United States. And then things started to get really serious this past December, just last month, where Trump again asserted the importance of the US taking control of Greenland. He appointed the governor of Louisiana, Jeff Landry, to be the US special envoy to Greenland over the objections of the Danish government. But then the whole crisis really reached a crescendo in the days after the US attack on Venezuela on January 3rd. And we did a lunch and learn about this a couple of weeks ago, but in the days that followed, Trump started to make increasingly aggressive statements about his desire to take control of Greenland by force if necessary. And he said at one point, I would like to make a deal, the easy way. But if we don't do it the easy way, we're going to do it the hard way. And obviously, in the aftermath of the Venezuela operation, people were taking this deadly seriously. Then on January 5th, Trump's advisor, Stephen Miller, made a particularly ominous statement to the press in an interview with Jake Tapper of CNN, where he said the following: We live in a world, in the real world, Jake, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. These are the iron laws of the world since the beginning of time. A few days later, various European countries, including all the Scandinavian countries, UK, France, and Germany, then participated in the military exercise in Greenland with the aim of trying to demonstrate Europe's commitment to Arctic security. The intention was to try to reassure Trump and let him know that Greenland was essentially kind of in good hands, that NATO allies were going to be there to protect Greenland. Instead, as far as we can tell, it had the kind of unintended consequence of Trump interpreting that as a way of kind of the European allies trying to kind of poke their fingers in the eye of the US. And that made him even more enraged. And then on January 17th, Trump made the shocking announcement that he was going to impose a 10% tariff on all the countries that participated in that exercise that would take effect from February 1st, and that would then increase to 25% on June the 1st, unless Denmark agreed to sell Greenland to the US. You may remember too, given that we're talking about events that took place just over a week ago, that things got even more serious the next day when I think it was a week ago last Sunday, when Trump sent a message to the Prime Minister of Norway, where he expressed his anger at not having been given the Nobel Peace Prize. And then on the topic of Greenland, he said, quote, he no longer feels an obligation to think purely of peace. Then last week, last Monday was the Martin Luther King holiday. The stock market was closed. On Tuesday of last week, when the stock market reopened, the S&P index fell about 2%, and US bonds were beginning to fall in value. Perhaps because of this, Donald Trump began to kind of backtrack. And then last Wednesday at the Global Economic Forum in Davos, Trump seemed to abruptly climb down from his stated position vis-a-vis Greenland. He met with Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, and came out of that meeting claiming that the US and NATO had reached what he calls the framework or the concept of a deal. Right now, it's really not clear what that deal involves. All we know is that Trump has withdrawn his threat of these punitive tariffs on the European allies. He has stepped back from any idea of using military force against Greenland. And in exchange, we think NATO has given some kinds of assurances to the US about greater cooperation around Arctic security. And there may or may not be some discussion about Greenland giving the US some sovereignty to a limited degree over US bases in Greenland. But it's not at all clear whether anything like that has been agreed. And the messages from the Danish government certainly suggest that that's not the case. So I will stop there with my little kind of synopsis of what's happened. And I'm now going to turn to my colleagues in international relations and ask them to give their take or their interpretation of these events and what their implications may be. So we'll start first with my colleague, Chris Clary.
Thanks, Brian, for sort of setting us up how we got here. I think the nice thing about these Lunch and Learn series is it allows us to look at serious political issues, and we're sadly current events are not devoid of politics, and we could probably have a lunch and learn every day on the issue du jour. Let me come at it from this way. When I think about the Greenland episode, I actually find it's very instructive to help us understand the answers that scholars have given for why there might be a liberal international order in the first place. Because it's a bit puzzling. This earlier generation of scholars was clear and observed. Why would powerful states that have the ability to do so much in international politics, why would they ever set up a set of rules that confines them to maybe going through certain procedures before they can take justified military action overseas, and confines them perhaps on the sorts of behavior that are even acceptable under any procedures. And that tendency of an earlier generation of American leaders, especially in the aftermath of World War II, to try to build this rules-based order that bound, at least in theory, U.S. power. In practice, of course, powerful states skirt the rules and occasionally breach them. But they have paid tribute to those rules by at least trying to use rhetoric and go through international organizations so that there's a patina of rule adherence when even powerful states go through this behavior. And the answers these earlier scholars gave were manyfold, but let me focus on two. One is there's probably some benefit for powerful states to create a rules-based system that other states spend some effort enforcing, as that powerful state itself may go into decline. Not, it is the case that the history is littered with hegemons, and the United States has had a long run. We're entering our second century, arguably, of hegemonic status. But this too will fade with the waxing and waning of the world, and it may be better for powerful states when their power fades, for them to be some rules that protect them. But the more important argument, the one that I find more persuasive, I think is actually exhibited by this episode, is if you can get buy-in from less powerful states into this regime that you create, and you do that buy-in by having some predictability and some sort of constraint on your own behavior, then that legitimacy makes your job easier. You don't have to use your power and your ability to coerce and your brute force to reach end states you desire. You can use the much cheaper means of persuasion. And the rules-based order gave a legitimacy to American hegemony, which allowed European, Latin American allies globally. Not everyone was a US ally or partner, but they were rowing the boat in the same direction. And when you ignore the rules and you don't care about legitimacy, and you say, as the Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, said, that this is the iron rules of humanity as the power governs the international system, there's something to that. International relations scholars may be a bit dense, but we did not ignore the existence and power for all these years. But life is easier if people think you're doing legitimate actions. And the moment they cease to believe that legitimacy, they might fake it for a little bit. This is what's so, I think, clever about Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech he gave at the World Economic Forum last week. But eventually they will say, I can't keep up this charade anymore. And I'm going to throw some sand in the gears. I'm going to make life difficult for you. And I'm going to start opposing you on things. First, maybe things you don't care so much about, but then maybe on things you do care about. And it makes the job of hegemony harder. And so I think the Greenland episode, in the pushback it generates, in the crisis it caused in the Western Alliance camp, it helped kind of be the exception that proved the rule about why an earlier generation of American leadership might have been willing to build this order in the first place, and perhaps the enduring wisdom that exists in trying to maintain that order. My last point I'll make, though, is people have historical memories, and it will be very difficult and perhaps impossible to go back to some sort of status quo ante. That will be true for the Trump administration as it tries to behave and build consensus with European partners. But more importantly, for future American leaders, diplomats, they will have to deal with the fact that the world will remember that US policy can shift erratically, and those erratic shifts include not just economic coercion, but the prospects for violent coercion as well, even against close treaty allies. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, we'll turn now to Bryan Early.
Thank you very much, Brian and Chris, for laying the groundwork and kind of setting up some of the foundational discussions. My name is Bryan Early. I'm really an expert on economic coercion, sanctions, proliferation. And what I want to focus on in terms of my angles here are the costs of coercion. One of the strategies that President Trump has consistently used during his first administration, but also in his second administration, is leveraging U.S. power, both economic and military power, to try to coerce countries around the world. And in some cases, he has made he has used that in a more exploratory version, where he threatens the use of tariffs. He threatens the withdrawal of assistance. He threatens to use military power, and in some cases he follows through with it, like in Venezuela. But what I really want to focus on are the times in which he uses U.S. power to engage in threats to try to coerce, or we could say compel, other countries into doing what President Trump wants. And so there are a lot of models that we have in scholarship and thinking about coercion. Some really famous people like Schelling are thinking. I've thought a lot about how military force can provide political power and influence by being able to convince other countries to behave the way you want them to without ever having to exercise it. The sanctions community is actually very interested in this. One of the puzzles for the studies of economic sanctions are oftentimes, why do imposed sanctions not work quite as well as we would expect? And the answer to that is a lot of the targets of sanctions actually give in at the threat stage, so that sanctions never have to be imposed. What's interesting, I think, about the Greenland case is that even if we don't have an actual conflict, the use of coercion in this episode, I think, has a pretty significant number of costs that we should consider. And these are costs that I think come into play, not in every case, not all of them in every case, not all efforts of President Trump to use coercion to further his view of U.S. national security or foreign policy or economic interests will entail all of these costs. But I think one of the concerns that scholars in the sanctions committee had during the first Trump administration is that the frequent use of economic coercion would eventually erode the U.S.'s position, the position of the U.S. dollar, the U.S. leadership in the global economy. And I think that more broadly, the Greenland case includes some of that, but includes a lot more. So I'm just going to go through a few bullet points that I think are important to think about. What is the potential fallout for this episode? The first, I think that this potentially undermines some of the value of U.S. security commitments to places like NATO, but other allies. Countries who become alliance partners of the U.S. do so for protection. And if your protector is also potentially a threat to you, even when you're cooperative, even when, frankly, you provide the U.S. what it says it wants, they're going to view security commitments with a lot more skepticism and not value them as much. And so if you look at the case of Greenland, the 2025 National Security Strategy, Greenland wasn't actually mentioned once. It wasn't in there. Greenland allows U.S. to have military bases and has going back to World War II and then in the early Cold War in 1950. The U.S. already has all the strategic advantages it really needs. And if your ally will turn on you for really non-important reasons, then it calls into question the value of having a U.S. alliance, not only from the U.S.'s ability to protect you from others, but what is the benefit of having a friendly relationship, an alliance relationship with the U.S.? If the U.S. can do this to its friends, that's a significant concern. This particular episode disrupted the trade deal, the new trade deal that the U.S. was negotiating with the EU after the first round of Trump tariffs. So not only was there the escalation, but it's really called into framework of whether EU thinks they can have a normal, reliable economic relationship with the United States under the Trump administration. Because if new tariffs can be introduced and the laws and treaties you sign with the United States don't matter, why bother to sign them? And that's going to create a lot more volatility in the U.S.'s ability to not only engage with historically important trade partners, but the rest of the world. Another key thing is the reliability of the U.S. As a kind of a global hub for international finance and trade. The value of the U.S. dollar, the willingness of other countries to purchase U.S. treasuries, the role of the U.S. dollar as a currency that's used to settle trade all around the world. All of these things benefit American consumers and the American economy. And the less stable the United States looks, the more disruptive the U.S. is in global security and economic relationships, the less desirable it is to be invested in America or to be reliant on America for not only your security, but also your economic relationships. And then finally, I think I'll just play to what Professor Clary said a little bit. I think this episode also makes U.S. leadership less attractive in the world. It lowers the difference or diminishes the difference between great powers such as the U.S. and Russia, who has also used military force to get what it wants. The People's Republic of China, who is also potentially thinking of doing that in the Taiwan crisis. The U.S. having moral and ethical leadership in the world goes a long way sometimes into persuading countries to do what we want them to do with, as Professor Clary said, without having to twist their arm every time. The attractiveness of the U.S. and its persuasiveness, or Joseph Nye called it soft power, diminishes, and so I think this is going to be one of the major downsides. Also, as part of this, countries that have traditionally been U.S. allies or U.S. friends might have to engage in what we call hedging behavior of deciding that they might need to strengthen their relationships with other great powers because the U.S. is no longer reliable. You look at the controversial trade deal between Canada and China. Well, if the U.S. has decided that it doesn't want to have a free trade relationship with Canada and that the U.S. will impose tariffs anytime as an instrument of coercion, anytime Canada does anything President Trump doesn't want, then Canada's going to start trying to find other relationships. And so all this to say that even if Greenland blows over, that this issue goes away and kind of simmers down, that there are true costs to this episode, and that the costs of this episode and future episodes, I think, are going to mount, maybe slowly at first. But the thing is that once countries decide to decommit from the U.S. as the cornerstone of their their security policy or the cornerstone of maybe their economic strategy or relationships, those things do not come back overnight, even if the administration changes its behavior, or even if we eventually have a maybe a change in the political party that's in charge of the United States. These are permanent potential structural changes that could be a consequence of all of these types of episodes that are occurring at greater frequency, both in the economic and, in this case, the security space. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, now we'll turn to Rey now.
Okay, thanks a lot, Brian, and thanks for the organizers to put this together in short notice. So I'd like to reflect on the impact of the current rupture in relations between the Trump administration and Europe over Greenland. And I want to warn you all, I'm going to make some highly speculative comments, but what the heck, it's for the conversation that we're going to have here. So please take some of this with more than a grain of salt. And I want to basically work through three topics and then a bonus topic probably for later. First, I want to focus on the impact that it may have for European integration. Secondly, European electoral politics. Third, the Trump administration's foreign policy towards Europe as articulated in that national security strategy that didn't mention Greenland. And then the last area, and something that we could hold off for later, but I want to put on the table, is I have some thoughts also on Arctic security capabilities themselves and how that relates to this relationship between the United States and Europe. So first off, European integration. So I think it's more than one European leader had said, in the run-up to Davos, that if the US uses force in Greenland, it will be the end of NATO. All right. Well, I want to go back a bit to a different period of time when the prospect of the end of NATO was on the table, and that was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And at that time, basically, Soviet Union is no longer a threat. The Warsaw Pact is over, right? So what do we need NATO for anymore? What's the purpose? And one of the things that was happening as well, the Europeans can now take care of their own security needs. And the French reinvigorated, brought back this idea of a European defense community. And that was going along, and to a certain extent, the administration of George H.W. Bush was initially welcoming of this idea of Europe taking more responsibility for its own security. But then there was a shift, a little backtrack on that, starting to think about some of those implications of that, and said, no, NATO is still important. And then there was also a bit of backtracking by Britain and France when Helmut Kohl took advantage of the situation with the collapse of the East German communist regime and moved very quickly towards German unification. Why? Well, in London and France, there was concern about united Germany being the most powerful country in Europe, and this whole history, this notion of Germany as a wanderer between East and West. And this was, and if we go back to that old saying about NATO, why do we have NATO? It's to keep the Russians out, to keep the Americans in, and to keep the Germans down. And it was that collective security function of NATO that allowed German rearmament initially and became important for the framework for German unification. And with respect to European integration, it was similar. How does Germany get tied in? And that was to add political union to economic and monetary union in the 1992 Maastricht Treaty. But the Maastricht Treaty also had a second pillar of common foreign and security policy and cooperation and justice and home affairs. While there was, some movement towards greater defense cooperation, et cetera, and some integration of rapid reaction forces, et cetera, that was another step. So in a sense, there was this period, it was overcome with some institutional adjustments and rethinking the purpose of NATO. And then, of course, we had enlargement, the Partnership for Peace, and the Eastern European states that were being embraced by the West. But, fast forward to the current situation, and what we have is keeping the Russians out. That is clearly an operation with the support of Ukraine by NATO. Keeping the Americans in, I don't know. It sounds, the way that the discussion goes, it's almost as if it's more of a collective security argument about the United States now attempting, in a sense, to play this outsized role and to actually threaten fellow NATO members. I'm putting in these kind of extreme terms because I think that's how it's being viewed in some quarters in Europe. Okay. And I think the German threat has receded over all these years. There's less of a concern about German rearmament, of German, playing a greater role. That's kind of gone by the wayside. So what we see here is the possibility for the kinds of European defense cooperation that had existed before. We see this particularly with, concerns about NATO. We had the Draghi report, the former prime minister and European Central Bank leader, who basically said we have to rethink finance. We have to think about how we deal with defending Europe from Russia and putting together ideas of issuing European debt to pay for weapons. All right. And this would be, in many ways, a game changer. One of the big problems, of course, in Europe is that there is fragmentation of defense production. Basically, you have national champions of various sorts, and there really isn't an integrated European defense production capability. And that's something that would take time to build. But this would also be one of the ways that Europe would become independent of the United States. And again, this is also one of the reasons back in the day, but perhaps even now, that might give particularly some members of Congress that have major defense industries pause about European independence in this area. Again, how things are being perceived in Europe. Let's look at electoral politics. This has not been good for the allies of the Make America Great political movement in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, for Deutschland, for the National Front, or the National Rally. They've reconfigured their name here in France, for Vox in Spain, for all of these right-wing, extreme right parties that, last year at this time were just over the moon. They made common cause with Trump. They used the make Germany first, make France first rhetoric, etc. But now what? Here we have the Trump administration not just focusing on making America first, but rather what's being interpreted as, well, in certain quarters, as imperialism on the left. And then also on the right wing side is that they're split now. Do we stick with Trump, or do we say that we really care about our own national sovereignty? And will we come to the aid of a fellow European country whose national sovereignty is threatened? So these parties that have, in some cases, like Orban in Hungary, have allied themselves in many ways with Russia, now have another kind of albatross with their aligning with Trump, the Trump administration. And my speculation here is that this is good news for the center-right and center-left parties in Europe. I mean, we see in Denmark, again, the social democratic government is doing very well currently with this external threat. And just a quick 1 minute, not minute, I've probably gone over, but just to talk briefly about that, the national strategy, which has a section called, promoting European greatness. And one of the problems of Europe, it's not just economic decline, but, quote, the real and more stark prospect of civilizational erasure. And basically, again, woke Europe, immigrants diluting the demography of European majorities, etc., all of this in here. And even identifying, we want Europe to remain European, to regain civilizational self-confidence, and to abandon its failed focus on regulatory suffocation, and literally identifying these right-wing parties as being allies. Well, just coming back to what I previously said, they haven't done this move in Greenland, whatever it might actually end up in the end accomplishing for the United States. We will talk about that, I'm sure, a bit, but it may have undermined the electoral prospects for those right-wing parties in European countries, and supported the center-right and center-left parties that have been, again, more pro-European integration, because the right-wing parties have been also anti-EU. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Ray. So finally, we'll turn to Greg, and then we'll open it up for some discussion.
Okay. I think I would like to take the comments in a somewhat sharper direction, more critical, if you will. First of all, if you look at the relationship between the United States and Canada, you know that the strategic value of Greenland can't possibly be a serious issue, because look at Canada's access to the Arctic. If you were concerned about the military situation in the Arctic, then you would want to hug Canada closely to you as a firm ally, which it already was. Instead, we've been driving it away. If anything, Canada will become more reliant on Chinese technologies, and that will subvert the cause of American defense. So I don't see, there's no coherence there. And there's very little coherence to what's going on. And we don't know that the Greenland episode is even over, because it could be back on the table next week. I'm reminded of a quote from Engels, who said in The Origins of the Family, "From its first day to this, sheer greed was the driving spirit of civilization. Wealth, and again wealth, and once again wealth, not of the whole, but of a single scurvy individual. This was its final aim." And I think we have found that scurvy individual in the current president of the United States. But let me give you an example of what I mean, because there is a kind of a broad sort of thing that's going on with this regime. Okay, we have crypto and finance and big tech and AI. We have the arms industry and we have oil and gas. These are like the big giant constellations of interest that are trying to get something out of this regime. But the regime is not coherently catering to those needs. Rather, what the regime does is it sees opportunities for the wealth of a single scurvy individual and his minions, and pursues those first. I'll give you an example. When we invaded Venezuela, they seized tankers full of oil. The oil was brought up to the United States and sold, and the money from the sale of that oil went into a bank in Qatar and has never been seen again. So what we have there is just the seizure of an asset and its sale and the privatization of the money, and it's brigandry. The moment during, I don't know if anybody saw the discussion that Trump had with all the representatives of the oil industry. He was representing himself as having done this enormous favor to the oil industry, and he's very pleased with himself. And then the president of Exxon gets up, and when the president of Exxon speaks, people listen. He says, Venezuela is uninvestable, and he could have said it even more strongly, but the point is that Exxon has invested $60 billion into the Permian, and they're going to spend another $30 billion in the next 4 years. They have their plans mapped out. What they don't need is low quality crude from Venezuela coming into the United States and driving down prices and upsetting their profit structure, which they've mapped out for the next 10 years. In other words, Trump may think he's doing something great for oil, but the biggest oil people know that he is undermining their interests, not supporting them. And so there may have been something like this with the Greenland episode, because some of the existential threats that people face, which glue them to the administration, oil and gas is really terrified about environmental regulation. Big tech and AI and crypto, they're really worried about regulation, particularly in Europe. And so something like the disintegration of NATO might be the end of any leverage these giant American interests would have in the European market. And that might be enough to get Trump to turn around on Greenland. So it wouldn't even necessarily be explained to him. I don't know if he can understand these ideas, but they would just say, no, you shouldn't be doing this. And he backed down because he respected the people that were telling him he shouldn't be doing this, people like Bezos and that sort of thing. So that's a possibility. But they're not sending me emails saying, well, Greg, this is why we're doing this. So I just have to sort of look at it structurally and say, how is this going on? How is this going down? And then finally, there's the arms industry, which stands to lose big if NATO breaks apart, because people don't understand this. The entire cost structure of the American military is based on long production lines, which reduce the per unit costs. So our jets that we buy for us cost less because we sell additional copies to NATO. And so that's a big part of the economics of the military industrial complex. And somewhere somebody may have been saying, well, hey, wait a minute, we need to think about this. But on the whole, if you're looking at the motivations of the regime, knock down the White House, get $300 million from this company or that company to build a gold palace. I mean, this is just sheer greed and the wealth of a single scurvy individual. This is a shakedown. And that's what the tariffs are all about too. There's no coherent tariff strategy there. It's just like you go up to a major industry and say, we're going to put a tariff on a lot of your inputs and it's going to raise your costs. How much are you going to pay me to knock the tariff back down again? That's what we have, is a shakedown of the entire American economy. It's really pillaging. And so that's the way I see it. I don't think that the Greenland was just something that Trump thought he could gobble up, and he was wrong. So, but how much more of this we're going to see, I don't know. To conclude, I think the speech at Davos by Mark Carney, the PM of Canada, was excellent. And I have thought a lot recently about things that I used to dismiss. Back in the 70s, when Kissinger and Nixon would talk about the credibility of the United States is at stake, and I would look at a map of the world, look at Vietnam, say, who cares? You know, why are we concerned about this? And I think now I know. Okay, the Europeans were looking at American deployment in the Middle East, and they wanted to know whether the United States had the capability and commitment to intervene militarily there. They wanted to know that the United States could defend the Europeans if push came to shove, and the whole concept of extended deterrence. And so, if you can't even defend, this small, weak country from another small, weak country, then what good are you? That was Kissinger's concern with credibility. He never put it in those terms, but I think that was very much in the forefront of his mind. So I'll end with that thought.
Okay, well, thanks so much, all of you. So in the remaining time, I'm gathering questions that some of you submitted in advance. I'd also invite those of you joining us on Zoom, if you'd like to submit a question to me again, you can send it to me as a direct message or put it in the chat, and I'll do my best to fit it in before the end of our session at 1 o'clock. So the first question is one that was submitted by someone in advance of the session, which I thought was quite an interesting one, and I'm going to ask my colleague Chris Clary to take this one. The question is, what are the parallels between Trump's designs on Greenland and Putin's desire to seize control of Ukraine?
They're a bit different. I think it is clear they both have at least a public-facing security motivation. I think Russia's desire to have Crimea and Eastern Ukraine is in a way more legible because that is a security threat that Russia and its Soviet and pre-Soviet incarnations has faced for, up to the Great Winter War, even, a long time ago. Trump has said that there is a concern about the Arctic. Sometimes this concern is interlaced with a belief that climate change may make certain passages navigable in the Great White North. But obviously, the administration is intensely concerned about the Arctic, but also, as a public policy, does not believe climate change exists. And so there is a certain tension with why Greenland will be important 20 years from now when it hasn't been crucial since World War II. And the last thing is, the one thing that may unite them is we have two governments that have a very strong personalist inflection. Sevagnitsky at University of Toronto, I think, has written well on this in a series of pieces over the last few years. But these are governments where the whims of one person can enormously shape policy. Now, Putin took a while to erode what were young institutions, put up by Boris Yeltsin, to make Russia so pliable to his whims. What is notable about Trump is that the dominance he secured in the Republican Party means that even though almost no Republican figures are enthusiastic about the Greenland escapade. That lack of enthusiasm does not meaningfully constrain his ability to veer policy around. Now, it may be challenging. It may partially explain why he backed down in the face of the tariff threat. Um, but it is notable that the president has steered policy on important states, on India, on others, which don't have the backing of many Republicans. In fact, I would encourage our audience. There are virtually no Republican foreign policy thinkers that have come out in support of a coercive campaign against Greenland. There is some very tepid support that says maybe a negotiated deal would be good that eventually gets Greenland under closer U.S. control. But the manner in which the president is pursuing it has very half-hearted support. Um, so I think the it is the nature of the leader and the ability of a leader that feels strongly about an issue that unites the two campaigns. Because unlike Putin and Ukraine, the United States has never had a claim on Greenland. So it is a de novo claim. Whereas Putin, I think, in his heart, does really believe that Ukraine is Russia, and that it should be Russian. I'll stop there.
Brian? Thanks, Chris.
I was just going to chime in that two academics, Abe Newman, Stacy Goddard, have come up with a theory that they call neo-royalism, in which they're kind of going back in time to almost medieval politics, and thinking about a time when international relations was driven more by the core interests of an elite few, political, economic, military leaders, and how the interests of those elites actually dominated international relations. And that when you think about the world today, that thinking about states and thinking about what we've long time considered national interests or national priorities is maybe not the right framework. And so they wrote a longer piece in International Organization. I just put in the chat a kind of a brief explainer from the New York Times recently. But I think it's interesting because it ties in what we see within the Trump administration to also potentially thinking about Putin, thinking about other kind of elites within the international system, and the way that they have been able to use their political positions not only to advance what we think of as traditional interests, but also, as Professor Nowell said, their economic interests, their notions of prestige and personal influence of themselves and their networks. And that potentially provides, I would say, a uniting framework of not only Putin and Trump, but also maybe this experience that it's not just democratic backsliding that we're observing, but maybe there's really a new kind of theoretical framework that we need to understand global politics. So if that helps, that's another I think really interesting piece of social science research that can help provide insight into the current moment.
I also want to thanks both of you for these answers. I also want to pick up on the question that Wilson Han, one of our advanced PhD students, raised in the chat, which is really getting on the question of ownership, right? Trump, at least in his public statements, made a big deal about wanting to own Greenland. And despite the fact that, so many people were pointing out, well, the US currently has a treaty with Denmark that allows us to open as many military bases as we want, he nonetheless wants to own it. I'd be interested to hear what my colleagues think about the issue of ownership of territory in the current kind of international regime. Does it really matter? And if so, why? Rey.
Yeah, I think it was Richard Rosencrantz in The Rise of the Trading State who basically made the argument that the possession of territory really didn't make as much sense in the changing economic environment and even the technologies that we have in security, et cetera, in providing our security. And I mean, look, I'm sorry, but Greg explained, it doesn't make sense. The oil there, really difficult to extract, doesn't make sense. The rare earths, I mean, under all of the ice, and by the way, rare earths, they're all over the place. They're rare because there's just so little of them and huge amounts of rock and dirt. It's extracting them and processing. That's the trick. That's what the Chinese developed, right? So the United States doesn't need any of Greenland's natural resources. So the only thing that makes sense to me is the vanity, the whatever, the analogies to real estate, uh, and to have like the biggest expansion of U.S. territory. It's all symbolic. It has little, if anything, to do with security because, again, we abandoned all those bases that were in Greenland at the end of the Cold War because they were too expensive, too hard to maintain for technologies and means of warfare that were no longer necessary. Yes, they can be reestablished if need be, really, but it's not there.
Okay, thanks, Ray. Another question that we got is, I mean, what does this mean for NATO right now? Is NATO in tatters, even though we're pretending everything's okay? And if the worst were to come to the worst and NATO were to basically kind of collapse, how bad would that be? Or sorry, I'll let Greg go first,
Go ahead.
then Ray.
I think NATO is absolutely in tatters, and people are having a hard time processing that. I don't think there's any going back because anytime, I mean, supposing we got a quote, a typical post-war liberal internationalist administration in after Trump, the problem that the Europeans face is that the turning of 1 or 200,000 votes in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Illinois and places like that could make the difference between a United States that they're happy to deal with and one that treats them like an enemy. So they're in a fundamentally untenable position, and I think a lot of what's going to happen over the next 10 years is delay. They're going to try to delay and maintain the relationship as best they can, but that they're going to go nuclear. I think that's inevitable. I think Poland and the Scandinavian countries and Germany will most assuredly go nuclear, and maybe others too.
Thanks. Ray?
I think the Europeans are sorry if it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think the Europeans have tried waiting out Trump the first time around. They're still trying to do that, and hopefully they'll, be successful in this approach. But it's interesting, the unilateral approach that I mentioned, developing their own defense capabilities, et cetera. This is going to take a very, very long time for that to happen. So an independent European defense community, as the Gaullists have dreamt about for a long time, would take a long time too. And what I found very interesting is that in terms of critical Arctic security capabilities, what are they? Icebreakers. That's one of the big problems. The United States, Russia has a fleet of over 40 polar icebreakers. China now operates 4 with a 5th on the way. The United States has 3, and they are put together with a wing and a prayer and surplus parts. So here's what the Trump administration has done: has made a deal with Finland to purchase icebreakers from Finland. So it's interesting. So on the one hand, there is all of this breach and rupture, yet the Trump administration, and it's not all made in America either, approach is going to be importing icebreakers from, well, of course, Finland has the great capability and they've been doing it for a long time, making icebreakers. So in one way, I can't help but to think that there's a lot of Sturm und Drang, that there is a lot of the symbolic politics going on, but this could just also be just one in a series of various adventures that have a lot of, PR value and get the attention of the media for a brief period of time, but then it's just a part of the chaos that is the Trump administration.
Well, thank you. We are at 1 o'clock, so I will have to wrap us up there. But please join me in thanking our excellent panelists for that very enlightening discussion. I would like to and thank, of course, all of our audience for joining us on Zoom and submitting questions both in advance and during the talk. I'm just sorry I wasn't able to get to them all. Before we sign off, just please remember next Tuesday, 12 p.m., we're going to do the next Lunch and Learn discussing the crisis in Minnesota with Julie Novkoff and Rob Warden. So thanks very much, everyone. Bye.